Hello and welcome to today's video. So in today's video I'm going to very quickly go back through unit number 1 on the first occupants and cover a lot of the central concepts for you. So let's get started. Okay, so to start off, when we look at the first occupants, we're going to try to break this down into sort of 4 questions or 4 categories, really, and that is the who, the where, the what, and the why. So the first thing we're going to look at is the who, and what we mean by that is we are going to break down who specifically we're talking about when we look at the first occupants. So let's just blow this up right here. And the first question of who is really straightforward because we're really only going to discuss 3 groups of people. And those groups are the Inuit, the Algonquin, and the Iroquois. Now that's not to say that there weren't other groups that we can recognize. However, these are 3 in particular that we look at. The reason we look at it is because the Algonquin and the Iroquois both live near something very, very popular in our history class, which is the St. Lawrence, which is that body of water right here and sort of made its way down through. And essentially, that body of water is very important to us in this history class. So that's why we look at the Algonquin and the Iroquois. Okay, so this is where we're at. So we have the Algonquin and we have the Iroquois. So those are the who: Inuit, Algonquin, Iroquois. Okay, so now the next thing we're going to do is we're going to turn our attentions to the question of the where. So where did each of these groups live? So if we take a look at this map for a moment, what you're going to end up seeing is that each of these groups lives in very distinct areas. So let's start with the Inuit, who are the group of first occupants who live furthest north. Okay, so the Inuit live in what was called the subarctic. Okay, and so they're the most northern. Okay, that says northern. Next, we turn our attention to the Algonquin, and the Algonquin were the group that lived north of the St. Lawrence Valley. Okay, so north of it, so on top of the St. Lawrence Valley. Finally, we look at the Iroquois, and the Iroquois actually lived in what is considered to be sort of the south part of Quebec, the east part of Ontario, and really, in many ways, it's now sort of where New York City, like New York City, it's sort of right there, okay? So that's the most further south. So those are the 3 groups, and this is where they live. Okay, so now that we've covered the where, we now shift our attention to the question of the what, as in what makes each of these groups different but also similar. So when we look at all 3 of these groups of first occupants, there's a number of things we can look at to answer what makes them different from one another. So if we take a look at the image right here on the left, this is an image of the Inuit group. And they live in the Arctic, okay. And because they lived in the Arctic, they would face very long, never-relenting, cold climate, and so they had to build dwellings, as you can see here, called igloos. In addition to that, the Inuit were a nomadic group, meaning they would move from place to place, and they would rely on hunting as a way for them to survive. In addition, they would also fish things like seal, walrus, beluga, and they would hunt caribou. Sorry, I meant to say they would fish, but they would hunt seal, walrus, beluga, and caribou. And so that is the Inuit group. Next, we have this group right here, which is the group known as the Algonquin. And the Algonquin group did not live in the Arctic. In fact, they lived in the eastern subarctic. And so they too also had long, harsh winters, and they had harsh, cool summers. However, they were a nomadic group. Nomadic is the second time now I've said that. A nomadic group is a group that moves from location to location, so they don't stay anywhere permanently. And the reason for this is because in order to survive, their subsistence activities were to hunt and to fish. And so they were similar to the Inuit in the fact that they would be hunters and fishers. But one of the differences between the Algonquin and the Inuit is their dwelling, as you can see here. These dwellings, as you can see, these are called wigwams, and wigwams were really, really interesting because they could be assembled very quickly, which was well suited to their nomadic way of life in the eastern subarctic. They were put together by bark because it was sewn into it, and it allowed them to be rolled up and then unrolled very, very easily so that they could set up and leave very quickly. Part of the reason for this is because they would follow the herds of animals around, and so they would really only stay in one location so long as the food supply was good. But once it cut out, or if there was a food shortage, they would then move on to another camp. Okay, so next, those we are going to look at our final group, and our final group is called the Iroquois. And the Iroquois were a little bit different than both the Inuit and the Algonquin because of the fact that they lived in longhouses and the fact that they were sedentary. Now, sedentary means that they would stay in a location for much, much longer. Because the Iroquois stayed in a location, they became good at doing a number of things. One of the things they became very good at was agriculture. This meant that if they were sedentary, they weren't moving around as much, and because they could stay in an area, they became very good at growing certain crops like corn, squash, beans. Now, it's not to say they didn't hunt and that they didn't fish, but which is true, they did, but they could also rely on agriculture or live off the land, which was fantastic. Another thing to make note of is the longhouses that they lived in. Longhouses were much, much more permanent sort of dwellings, and they would normally be grouped together in villages, and they were occasionally surrounded by protective walls called palisades that would not allow intruders to attack. And oftentimes in these villages, there would be as many as several hundred people living together in their respective longhouses. The other thing to note about the Iroquois is that they separated their tasks just like other Aboriginal groups based on gender. So the men were responsible for hunting, fishing, as well as for building their dwellings, the longhouses, as well as constructing protective walls. They also would clear forests from time to time and prepared for agriculture. Whereas the women were responsible for looking after children, for making clothing, to prepare food, and they would also collect firewood. They would collect harvests like corn. They would also harvest maple sap. And so men and women had a division of labor. They were very socially and politically organized. Now, I do want to just end this segment on the what by saying that although I've identified some of the differences, there are also very many similarities between all three groups. Some of the similarities that exist between all three are the fact that there was a division of tasks or responsibilities socially, so their social structure amongst all groups, right, Inuit, Algonquin, and Iroquois, was that there was a division of labor. There was a separation of the tasks, okay? Men were responsible predominantly for hunting, fishing, building longhouses, as well as building means of transportation. So umiaks, which the Inuit used, bark canoes, which the Algonquin used, and then finally, when you look at Iroquois, they themselves would use canoes. So there's a similarity between the three, okay? Politically, they were a little bit different, just in the way they organized themselves. So when we just talk about like nomadic versus say sedentary societies, one of the big differences you'll notice in their, just in their structure is that because nomadic groups often moved around, their groups were usually much, much smaller. They only had a few families because they could only move about, they had to move about easily and rapidly. The chief was chosen for his courage, his hunting abilities, and his influence over the group. So he became sort of the spokesperson or the leader. And they had a simple and flexible social and political structure that was well suited for a nomadic way of life. The difference is that for sedentary people, because they were a little bit more, or not a little bit, sorry, a lot more stationary, meaning they stayed in one spot, it gave them the opportunity to become way more complex in terms of their structure politically and socially. So their government was hierarchical, and it consisted of a lot of different levels or councils. Okay, so certain Iroquois nations joined forces, and they would form things called leagues, which were also known as confederations. And the purpose of these leagues were to ensure the security and the defense of the Iroquoian nations and to promote their common interests. So basically, the thing to take away is the fact that nomadic groups, okay, were much, much smaller, right? They would have a nuclear family, meaning the people who live in one wigwam. Then they had a hunting group they belonged to. It was like their extended family. Then they belonged to a tribe, which could be up to 100 or 200 people. And then they had their nation, which is everybody who shares a language. When we look at sedentary people like the Iroquois, you have your nuclear family, but then you have an extended family. Because of the design of longhouses and villages, you sometimes would have a number of families living within the same house. Next, you would have a clan, and a clan consisted of a number of families that considered themselves to be sort of ancestors. And then you had your village, right? And your village is where you would find several longhouses, and they belonged just to a few clans. Above that, you have the nation, right? And that consisted of several villages working together, and they all shared a similar language and culture. And then above that, if you started to combine a number of nations, you have a league. All that being said, that's a lot of information, guys. Really, all I'm trying to get you to understand is that sedentary people were much more complex than nomadic societies politically and socially. And finally, our last question for the unit number 1 on the first occupants is the why. So what I mean by why is sort of like the why did first occupants believe they were on the planet? Why are we here? So they had something called conception of the world. It's how they made sense of the world around them. So in Aboriginal culture, there was a very close tie to all their values, spirituality, as well as their cultural foundations to nature. Something called the circle of life, as you can see in this image right here. Okay, this is the circle of life. So the first Aboriginal peoples had a cyclical conception of the world. A cyclical conception of the world literally means that life is constantly going in a circle, right? You start, you live your life, and then eventually you come back to the starting point. That's my nice little diagram of a cyclical conception of time. So in other words, they perceived that time literally starts over. They believe that life, just like nature, is perpetually starting over. They observed nature. And so in particular, they would look at things like life as being a cycle, a circle, and a cycle that begins with birth, life, death, and then a return to the afterlife for the spiritual world. Eventually, you would then be reborn, you would come back, and you would then live again and go through that process time and time again. Aboriginal peoples represented nature as a circle of life founded on the interdependence between animate beings, meaning humans, animals, and plants, and then inanimate beings such as rocks and spirits. So finally, just to finish off, okay, when I talk about the animate beings and inanimate beings, there's this concept, okay, known as animism. And that's really central to the why, their belief that everything has a soul, okay, that everything has a spirit, therefore everything should be treated with respect. All things produced by Mother Nature ought to be treated respectfully. Whether human, animal, plant, or rock, everything has a spirit, and everything in nature, just like in life, has a birth, life, death, and afterlife. Thanks for watching our review video as we get ready for the end of year exams. I hope today was educational and that you got something out of it. So I'll see you next time when we look at unit number 2 on the French regime. Bye-bye.